In high school, I knew there were lesbians, but they were all very masculine identified. And so they were known to us as dykes. And we were taught to be afraid of them, not to go in the bathroom with them. So my sense of being gay, that was the image, and that was not me. I knew that was not me.
From the Totem Project, this is Full Moon Women, a community and a podcast about the inner lives of women. In today's episode, we dive into the story of an 87-year-old woman who grew up in Harlem, married a man, and at the age of 40 came out of the closet. She went on to spend 30 years with her female partner before her lover died of an illness. After her partner's death, she became an activist for LGBTQ equal rights. She is a woman of color and a woman of faith. Her name is Mina Perry. I'm Jamie Younger, your host. This show and the community that surrounds it is centered on one belief. Your inner life matters. Your inner life is worth paying attention to. It's worth honoring, documenting, and sharing. My hope is that the stories we highlight on this show move something inside of you, and who knows what will happen after that. Every month, we publish the episodes in couplets. The first episode is one woman's story, something personal from her inner life, a long-form narrative piece. The second episode is a conversation that I have with someone who can give us a greater context and hopefully a greater appreciation for the storytelling woman's story. Today, we hear Mina's story, and in 2 weeks, we'll hear my conversation with Robin Cloud, a filmmaker and a comedian who brings queer and Black and brown lives to the stage and screen. As I shared earlier, Mina is edging on 90. She lives alone in New York City, not too far from where she grew up.
I grew up in Harlem. My parents were poor. We were a family of 8 children, mom and pop and grandmother. My parents were not formally educated beyond high school. My dad, I think, probably completed elementary school. But somehow they were very successful. They were strong community activists. Dad became head of one of the unions on the Pennsylvania Railroad where he worked. We were a family that was striving, middle-class status. That was our ambition. The girls were always told, you must finish college so you're not depending on a man. That was very explicit. Dad was a deacon in his church. We were a family with very much of a faith background. He was what we called in those olden days a race man, race, R-A-C-E, which means he was very strong on his identification as a person who was Black. We called it colored in those days. Although Dad could have been white, he could have passed for white, and he was frequently told, you can pass.
In case you're not familiar, racial passing is when a person who is classified as a member of a certain group is accepted or perceived as a member of another. Historically, the term passing has primarily been used in the U.S. to describe a person of color or of multiracial ancestry who assimilated into the white majority to escape discrimination.
He had a very strong sense of who he was as a Black person. And he raised us with that sense of pride, sense of responsibility to our community, but also to our race. We had a very small wooden cabinet that served as our library, and that was full of the Britannica, which was the series of encyclopedias that you used in those days. But the rest of the library was full of Black publications, some journals, popular magazines, The Crisis, which was the NAACP, But he would always say, you have to be proud. I would come home from school and I would say to him, Dad, my teacher says I can't be Black. I must be Hawaiian or something. There were no Puerto Ricans in those days in school, so the teacher felt Hawaiian. And Dad would say, no, you're not Hawaiian, and you tell her you are not Hawaiian, you are Black, period. He also, because of his Southern background, both of my parents were raised in the South, he had a very suspicious, reserved attitude about white people. So he was always cautioning us not to be too trusting of white people. Certainly in his small North Carolina town, there was very strong segregation and very strong behavior that required you to be subservient to white people. And when we visited as children, that was the first thing we were told. Don't talk back to white people. Don't trust white people. But most strongly was the business of being proud, the business of having responsibility to family, to community, and also to your race. You mustn't do anything to embarrass any of those groups that you were affiliated with.
So that's how Mina grew up. When she turned 18, she became one of the very first students of color to attend Brooklyn College. That was in 1952. She was part of the first wave of students to integrate the school.
It wasn't a good experience for me. There was a small group of us that had come in together. I had come from an all-Black elementary, mixed, integrated junior high school. But as I said, my parents had strong ambition for us to go to college, but they were not in a position to offer anything in the way of academic support. So it was all, this is what we wish for you. This is what you must do. There were a group of us that came in together, and I was, myself and one other friend were the two from like poor families. The others, they had gone to private schools or their parents were professionals. And of that group, I was the only one that made it. Even as an adult, when I would say to white people, oh, I finished Brooklyn College, the remark was always, what year, and was that before affirmative action? And of course, it was before affirmative action. And just their statement made clear to me their understanding and their attitude towards us as Blacks who had come into their school.
Mina was very clear about her racial identity in a positive way from her dad and in a negative way from the white people around her. I wondered how she thought about or understood her sexuality during her teens and 20s.
I went to an all-girls school, maybe one of the only ones that was open in New York City at that time. And it was a very prestigious school. We grew up in a very old building with a very elaborate staircase. But along the walls were the photos of all the women who had graduated from the school. And they were very famous women. At that time, there was no Black woman, but we knew the white women, and they were very famous women. So I did not grow up with boys. My life was a female life. I got a boyfriend probably in my senior year. He was a bad boy. He just had a very bad reputation, very handsome, but very bad reputation. In high school, I knew there were lesbians, but they were all very masculine identified. And so they were known to us as dykes. And we were taught to be afraid of them, not to go in the bathroom with them. So my sense of being gay, that was the image, and that was not me. I knew that was not me. You know, you grow up and you are taught, you find companionship in marriage with a man. So that's what I did. It was only after I was in therapy that I understood and revealed to myself in therapy in a very conscious way that I had had serious crushes and relationships with females all the time of growing up, even though I got married.
I was imagining Mina as a young woman in the 1950s growing up in Harlem. I asked Mina to tell me about some of her preteen crushes.
Two things I remember. One, there was a very, very good friend. Oh, I really, really loved her. She lived about 2 blocks from me. And we would come home together from school, and she would walk me home, and then she would likely proceed 2 more blocks to her home. But then I would walk her home, and then she would walk me back home. So it was like we couldn't find a way to separate. As we got older, her circle broadened and another woman was brought into the circle. And I was so jealous. And I knew I was jealous, but I didn't give it any name or anything. I've always had very close female friends. I had a very close female friend, and she was liberated and on her own. And she had a furnished room. Growing up in New York during those years, the way you emancipated from your parents' home, if they permitted it, was to get a furnished room. And you had a self-contained unit. But those furnished rooms were usually in brownstones, often owned by Black West Indian families. And it was like an extended family. It was a safe situation, but you were on your own. So I would, after work, go to her place and we would hang out. And we would sometimes go to a club together, have dinner together. And this was like almost every night. And once I said to myself, if she approaches me, she had lots of relationships with men. But I said, if she approaches me, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes. She never approached me. So that was it.
It didn't seem like Mina had rejected her feelings for women, but more that nothing had ever materialized. Nevertheless, I had to wonder, what did she do with those thoughts and feelings that were coming up inside of her?
The fear of being gay, that was never part of my life. My dad would sometimes say, because in the Black church, it's a known thing that the choir masters are gay. That's like a given. But my dad, as well as some of the other church people, would only say, he's a little funny. And they'd use their hands to say that. But there was never anything that was more negative than that. Never. I did not grow up in a household like that where you were taught to reject people. That was never our training. If I rejected what I was feeling, obviously it was because I was taught it wasn't acceptable, but not that it was negative or bad, just that you didn't do that if you were a girl. I don't know if that makes sense.
But Mina did marry a man. Well, actually, she married 2 men.
Yes, I married 2 men. The first one I married when I was very young. Maybe I was 18. It lasted a year, and I remained unmarried until maybe I was about 22. I married again, and that lasted 16 years when I met Tony.
Tony is Antonia, but we'll get to that a little later.
I never not liked men, and I never not liked sex with men. But I always felt I'm not satisfied here in these relationships. And I also always felt I'm not sexually satisfied either. It wasn't something that I did not enjoy. I just felt like I'm not getting enough here. Something is wrong.
I was curious if Mina felt like her lack of satisfaction was due to the specific man that she was with, or just men in general.
I just felt shortly into the marriage. I'm not growing here. I'm not developing myself. This is just not a relationship that's going to enable me to realize what I want to realize. I was always a person who had aspirations for myself, and being a wife became less and less acceptable. Talking about traditional roles, I would go out with him, with his friends, and I would sit there like a dummy while all the men talked. And I was a college professor with more education than any of them. And I thought, what is this?
So I realized that I had asked Mina about the sexual aspects of being with a man and how that didn't satisfy her. But her answer to me was focused more on how held down she felt by her role as a wife. So the two seemed intertwined, sexual passion and feeling free to pursue her ambitions. I tried to imagine how she dealt all those years, for 16 years, being in a relationship that was both unsatisfying and limiting.
Well, I would say the last years, really wasn't a relationship. I was teaching at the university. My life was very separate from his, even to the point that I had a separate bedroom. We were living together in the house, but we were not together. I would not even say that we were friends at that point. There just was no relationship. I did what I wanted to do, including I took a year off and accepted a visiting faculty position. I was living in San Diego, in New York, and I resolved that when I came back, that the marriage was going to be over. I didn't do it immediately, but I just knew this is not for me. I was frustrated till I got frustrated enough to make a plan to get out.
So 16 years into her marriage with her second husband, Mina is halfway out the door. She's saved money and she knows where she is going to live.
I was preparing to leave, where I was going to go, how much money I had to do it.
But then she met Tony, Antonia Pantoja. At the time, Mina was about 40 years old, and she was the director of the undergraduate school for social work at San Diego State University in California. Tony was joining the faculty. The dean asked Mina if she would mentor Tony, which put the two women in very close contact.
Well, she came with a reputation. She had developed many institutions in the Puerto Rican community, and my husband was Puerto Rican. So her reputation preceded her, and everyone knew she was coming with a woman. So I knew she was coming as an out lesbian, whether she thought she was or not. Everyone knew they were a couple coming together.
So one night, there is a small faculty house party. Mina shows up with her husband, Tom, and Tony is there. So Mina and Tony start talking, and then they keep talking and talking and talking. They eventually talked late into the night. They were both radicals in the field of social work, and they were thrilled to find each other.
I thought to myself, I have never met such an interesting woman in my life. I have never met a woman that has so much in common with me and thinks the way I think. She was older. She was 11 years or 12 years older. And she's a Puerto Rican woman from Puerto Rico. I had just never met anyone like that before. And I was just so attracted to her for those reasons. And because she had so much experience, although I was supposed to be mentoring her, it was very clear that I had much to learn from her. One day, as we worked together, we really spent lots of time together. One day I said to myself, you're in love with this woman. Just like that, I said, you're in love with this woman.
Mina accelerated her move. She moved out and got an apartment, and she told Tony she was leaving her husband.
I said to her, I'm leaving Tom. I'm not asking you to leave your partner. She had been in a long-term relationship like I had. But I want to let you know that I'll be here, whatever you decide. And that was the way it started. She left her partner, and we began to live together.
I asked Mina if that was the very first time in her life that she was acknowledging to herself that she was lesbian.
Yes. And her partner said to her, oh, Mina's going to get afraid and leave. Well, 30 years. I remember the first night we went to a faculty meeting together, and they knew my husband. People asked me, oh, where's Tom? And I said, we're not together. And obviously, Tony and I were together. So it was clear to everyone that I had turned lesbian. I had turned lesbian. And I never felt any embarrassment, fear, apprehension. It just seemed like so natural to me. I just felt like this is it. And I think for the first time in my life, I remember my inner self saying to myself, this may be a relationship that has problems in it, but this one you're staying in. You're staying in it. And that is it.
I started to imagine Mina like somebody who had broken out of a prison of some kind, going from being in a straight marriage to being out and gay and proud.
I felt so confident and fully myself and like free, and I could have my career and I could advance in my career. It's a very interesting thing. The feeling that I had decided to take this step, be an out lesbian, sort of in defiance of society's roles for me, gave me not only a sense of, it gave me a sense of power in some strange way. It in some way felt like I had entered a secret society, but it also felt like, okay, you have broken this sort of role they have placed on you. And now that you know you have done this, you are capable of whatever you want to do and be. You have broken the shackles. Yeah, I felt that very strongly.
When somebody decides to go their own way, there's usually a price to pay. There's usually people that don't like the new you because the new you changes the orientation. No pun intended.
I want to just go back and say, while no one in the faculty, because there were gay women in there, ever said anything to me, where I experienced negativity was from my community. I had been very active in the Black community.
That's her community in San Diego, California.
In fact, I had helped to set up an alternative school. And because of my political views, I was very much connected and involved with the group that we would call nationalist. And they rejected me completely. And I really lost all the base I had in the Black community. So that's where I felt the negative. But, I was developing with Tony, alternative educational school. I mean, I was so busy. We bought a building that it didn't matter. I felt it. I felt hurt, but I knew their values and I knew that I could not fit in their values. So, and I never really saw them again.
It really hit me to hear Mina talk about losing such a big part of her community and part of herself. The intersectionality of race and sexuality became very real in that moment for her. She was a professor and had developed strong mentoring relationships with Black female students.
And there were so few students of color there. So to lose a connection I had, especially females, and they would later sort of turn against me and drop their relationship with me. And that hurt me because they were the sort of base that kept me in the School of Social Work. It hurt. It felt bad. But on the other hand, Tony and I were building an alternative educational institution, and that had Black students. We picked up Asians, Mexicans, Filipinos, poor whites, and Blacks. Those are the students we taught. So I didn't really lose ethnic identification. In fact, I gained because I never met a Mexican. I never met a Filipino. So it was a whole new experience. And also to have a relationship with poor white students, adults.
I thought back to moments in my own life when I had made big shifts. And I remembered that some of the outward parts of my personal expression had changed. And I wondered and asked Mina if she had felt more free to dress differently, to somehow throw off sort of more of the girly clothes that she had worn during her quote unquote straight days.
If you see any of the pictures, I mean, I was very feminine before, very feminine. All of a sudden, I started wearing tailored jackets, sweaters underneath, flat shoes, very matching and very good looking. I was no longer presenting so feminine. And I remember the way the men in the faculty, the way I used to relate to them. And I said to Tony, this can't keep up because what's going on is you male and female, when you're interacting or even just looking at each other, there is this kind of undercover sexual or something going on. And she said to me, I'm going to teach you what to do. And she said, this is the way you're going to do. You're going to look at them, but you're going to look right through them as though you don't see them. You're not going to make any personal connection. And they, in turn, then are going to turn off whatever they are experiencing or feeling towards you. And that's the way it's going to be. You're going to look through them. That worked. That worked.
That's not the only thing that her partner, Tony, taught her.
Then she said to me, you do all the work and then you give it away to men. You let them take it as their work and put their name on it. That has to stop. So I learned you don't give away your work, you take ownership of it. So there were changes like that went on, and I considered that I was deprogramming the feminine Mina and becoming this other person. Not a masculine identified, but I just would no longer carry that subordinate identity anywhere within me.
That's radical, truly radical. This was all the stuff that was happening in her career, in her community. But what about inside their relationship? What was happening between her and Tony as a couple?
It was very different being with a woman. Because what are you? Are you like sisters? She was older than I was. But it was like you were looking and experiencing yourself in this other person, if that makes any sense. And your bodies were the same. You were in mutual relationships, whether they were sexual or whether they were work or whether they were social. You were not in any competitive situation, dominant power situation. Now, I know that this is not true of all lesbian relationships. I don't want to give that impression, but this was true for Tony and I.
Certainly, there was a big difference in personality between them. Tony was a very strong personality. In 1996, Tony was the very first Puerto Rican woman to receive the American Presidential Medal of Honor. That was given to her by President Bill Clinton.
I remember early on saying to myself, this is a powerful woman, and you better get yourself together, or you're gonna get lost in this relationship. And I actually talked to her about it, and we made a decision. We're working together. We are clear the areas in which we are working. And when we're in the office, I'm in my area physically and also whatever work I'm doing, and you're in yours. And in the office, she was always the head of the institution. I respect you as the head of the institution, but you don't come into my area and tell me what to do.
Mina and Tony were together for 30 years. They could never legally marry because it was not legal in the United States. Tony passed away in 2002, and same-sex marriage became legal in the U.S. in 2015.
We found the cancer late, and it had metastasized. They gave her 4 months. She lasted 3. But she was well. She finished a book she was writing. She did some other work. She was only incapacitated the last week. It was very painful. I had thought, I want her to know that, once she's gone, I'm not going to jump up and have someone else. So I said to her, will you marry me? Because you couldn't get married. We decided to have a ceremony of commitment. And we invited all of the lesbian couples that have been in our lives. And one of our friends who had a loft set up a beautiful dinner. And we had a person give us what were vows at that time, what was legally possible. And we had a ceremony.
Just to clarify, this was happening after Tony had been diagnosed with cancer.
She came in a wheelchair. She talked about what was happening to her in very indirect ways because she never discussed personal stuff. People accused her of not being out, not being open. But Tony was the kind of person, she would never ask you anything about your personal life unless you wanted to share it. But you also could not ask her anything about her personal life. So she talked about our relationship and the fact that this was an opportunity to say out loud, who we were as a couple. Although, all of us had been friends and everybody in the room was gay. But she was saying out loud that we were a couple. And I was the one who talked about what we were facing, her pending death. It was a beautiful ceremony. It was really beautiful. I would say probably 20 people or so. Well, I said that we were glad that everyone had come and that they were aware of what we were facing. And the person who really set up the whole thing, actually paid for the whole thing, had gotten a cake, and he had searched, he said, all over the city for one white bride. I have them here, and one a little darker. that was me, because she was lighter. And then he played all of the music that she loved, and it just played throughout the ceremony. And there were flowers. I had a bouquet, and pictures were taken. A video was taken. I remember she saw the photos before she died. The young man brought them to the house, and she looked at the picture of me with her. And I had gotten all dressed. I had on a nice little hat because my hair was a mess. And she said, "Who's that beautiful woman with me?" Which means she hadn't recognized me. Coming home, she was in the wheelchair and she fell. But they had to pick her up and carry her upstairs. And she was always very small and petite. And by then she was even smaller. And I think it was then that she must have decided she could pass. She could leave. They told me she'll make it for 3 days. So I stayed in the hospital. And I said to her, "I love you." And she said to me, "I love you." And she never said another word and never opened her eyes again. So after all these years, it still is painful.
In 2002, Mina held a small ceremony for friends. She spoke at those events. Her community showed up for her. Tony's Puerto Rican community gave Mina the opportunity to speak at their ceremonies for Tony. And then it all kind of went silent. Mina had dedicated herself to Tony's care for 3 years. And in that process, Mina lost herself.
I had no self. It was about her. It was about being there for her. I had lost weight. My hair was a mess. I hadn't taken care of myself. After she died, I was completely and absolutely lost. Half of me was gone. I would walk the streets of New York crying, afraid if someone asked me, "Why are you crying?" that I did not have the courage to say I lost my partner. She was a woman. So I would just cry. I don't know why. I don't know how they didn't see me crying, sitting there on the bus crying, but no one ever said anything to me. A lot of friends would take me out to dinner. And as you know, right after death, you can have a lot of friends and then, they go about their life. So you're left alone. And I just was getting more and more depressed and more in a bad situation. And I started thinking, well, I can't live. I won't live. I could walk in front of a car and kill myself. I just can't go on without her. I don't remember the sequence, but I had decided if I was going to have any sanity, I should try to return to church. I hadn't been in a church in like 50 years, but I learned that the Riverside Church here in New York had an LGBT ministry. I said, okay, I'm going to go there. They say now, even critics of the Black church, if you've grown up in the church, that stuff is in you. You know, that was a community, my dad's community. That was a place of support and comfort. So I thought of church that way, not of the damnation, but of church that way. And I was into this suicide. I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to kill myself. And I had this experience. You can say, I don't try to describe it spiritual or whatever, but I heard a voice say to me, if you love this woman so much, you don't die, you live. And you live and you know, continue your work. And that was it. I think it was after that I went into therapy because I felt I have to learn and I have to rebuild who I am. Ironic, because I said when you're married to a man, you lose yourself. But here I was really having to build myself and who I was by myself, create a new identity. I joined the church. I became the head of the LGBT ministry. And I became an activist. It started with LGBT youth. I was a marriage equality advocate. I remember they were having a rally for marriage equality at a local temple here. And I don't know how I got invited to speak. And I started my speech by saying, I'm a Black lesbian, age, I was 71 years, survivor of a 30-year same-sex relationship. And I am here to place a Black face and a Black experience on this marriage equality movement. Because I felt it was all white, it was all young people getting gowns and dressings and, you know, and I wanted to say, somewhere in this work you're doing has to be the older person, because we die too and we lose our partners. And you have to recognize that we need the marriage also. Tony died, my income doesn't even take a day for the Social Security to cut off the check, which meant that half of my family income was gone. Just like that. And I said in this speech, you know, there is for us that income loss and the grieving. And well, the thing went over so well. It hit the newspapers. The head of the big St. John's Cathedral here sent me a little note. If there's anything you need, come to me. I mean, I made such a hit. I kept on doing marriage equality speeches and work. And I slowly, you know, began to identify myself as a LGBT activist of faith. And that's it. My life changed. I got a new direction. I got a new purpose. And that's what I do now since she died in 2002. I still have a project I'm working on.
Mina is working with Equality New York, a statewide advocacy and policy organization for New York State. Mina is on their advisory board as the head of their faith group. She is recognized as an elder of the Black LGBT community. Although she lives alone in New York, she's got a ton of connections. She spends much of her time online, writing on her blog. I love her blog's title, The View from Here, Musings of a Sassy Sista. And she does, the usual 87-year-old stuff.
I'm a Facebook addict. If it weren't for Facebook, I couldn't survive. And a few weeks ago, Facebook told me, we're going to stop you for an hour or so because you're posting too much. But this is for me, social connections, because my social connections, particularly with the pandemic, became very limited. So for me, this is, these are like my social connections. And of course, I have my blog. So I get up in the morning and I'm on Facebook, and then I work on my blog. I prepare the one that's coming up, but I also look what ideas am I interested in, how can I research them. I'm still doing all of my household chores. It's becoming more difficult. I started suffering with vertigo. And because of diabetic neuropathy, I don't walk very well. I'm understanding more and more my age and the limitations it places on me, and accepting the realization that the things that I do have to be limited.
I asked Mina if she would read a specific poem that I had seen on her blog.
The little old lady in the window. I watched the little old woman who was walking slowly and trying hard to stand straight and appear strong. If only the others knew that her feet hurt and her back is really a bit more bent. She holds her body straight and just takes one foot slowly in front of the other. Her feet are hurting so badly. Does anyone notice, or is she fooling only herself? Why the pretense when it hurts harder by trying so hard? If she could find a bus stop bench or a window where she could just unnoticed pause for a few minutes. She says to herself, no one is looking at you. No one is thinking about you. However, her vanity requires her to keep up the pretense. Oh, how my feet are hurting. As she passes a glass window, she looks at the face looking back at her. She sighs. When did the little old lady become me?
Mina told me that she started the blog to express the real Mina, the side of her that not many people had seen. I asked her who that person was.
The person who allows herself to be vulnerable, allows people, I learned this in therapy, allows people to come closer. I was always a very gregarious person growing up. Tony was not, so I kind of adapted the way she was. And although we had lots of friends together, I felt like I began to understand living with her the way in which I had kept people out. And when you're a faculty, it's very easy to do that because you go into role. You know, you have relationships with students, but there's always the barrier. So I fell into a very comfortable place of being. And I maintained that even though I was no longer a faculty. I mean, I could counsel, I could be with you, be empathetic, but it wasn't touching me. I had a barrier there. So I think I'm less of that. I have learned since Tony's death in therapy the value of really having friends and letting friends come in, letting friends know how you feel, know what you're thinking, being helpful to you. I was in the hospital before the pandemic, and I tell you, my hospital bed was always crowded with people. I was very appreciative, but I thought to myself, what you have learned about sustaining relationships with people has paid off, because look at all the people here for you. People think I am an only child, and they think, I grew up in some middle-class home. I guess I present that way. I carry myself with a certain poise and dignity. My great-grandmother I'm talking about, that was a Native American, and I think I took some of that stoic kind of dignity, But they don't know I grew up with 8 kids, poor, poor, and I wanted to say that, I want you to know that about me, where I come from, because you don't know me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Full Moon Women with the charming and disarming Mina Perry. If you haven't subscribed to the show, please subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts. If you are moved by this story, we invite you to leave Mina a voice message. We would love to hear from you, and so would Mina. Just go to the show notes and look for the link that says voice memo. We may just include your message in an upcoming episode. Did you happen to notice that this show is totally ad-free? Well, that is totally by design, and we want to keep it that way. The way we keep it ad-free is through small monthly donations from our community of listeners. So if you find that the show enriches your life, even in a small way, we would be so grateful for your support. To join our community and make a pledge, click the Patreon link in the show notes. Patrons of the show can access an exclusive recording of Mina performing 3 of her poems. That's available on Patreon. If you're already a supporter of the show, just go to Patreon and check it out. And if you'd like to become a supporter of Full Moon Women, which starts at $3 a month, you can unlock access to Mina's poetry and so much more. This episode was produced by Pete Herkmans and myself. It was edited by Pete. I'm Jamie Younger, and you have been listening to Full Moon Women.